me something, Uncle Money?
Welcome to another episode of Building Wealth and Mental Health. We have Mr. Aren Ulmer. He is going for his certified mental performance consultant. This is a new area, an area that's growing, an area that I think is needed. So I think you're going to enjoy his journey. So, Mr. Ulmer, how are you doing today?
I'm doing good, Randall. I appreciate you for having me on.
Awesome. So let's get into it. Please explain a little bit more about the certified mental performance consultant and what is your ambitions when you try to gain that designation?
Ultimately, it's within the field of sport and performance psychology. It's a certification that denounces the amount of education and applied work that you've had within the field of sport and performance psychology. It's a pretty rigorous, amount of hours and mentorship and supervision that you have to go through in order to obtain that certification. So when I was finally able to attain it in August of last year, it was a huge plus for me. It's kind of like any other field, whether you're bar, doctor, you have those kind of benchmarks that kind of push you really into that professional realm. But I think ultimately it just really kind of puts you in line to work with whatever population you want to work with. The field of sport psychology is so broad. I can work at a local gym. I can work with a high school, a AAU team. But for me personally, my ambitions, my dreams, my goals are to get me within the professional sporting realm. Um, Whether that's American professional sports, I've had some experience already with international professional sports, but ideally the goal and ambition for me is to make it to the point where I'm working in a sports psychology, mental performance space within an American professional sporting organization.
I love it. Now, can you give us a little bit of background on the designation? Like, if do you know its roots? Do you know where it's kind of going? Do you know like what is this in the space of mental health?
So it's primarily on the mental performance side. So dealing with things as confidence, motivation, emotional regulation, performance anxiety. And another way to look at it is kind of mental skill training. That's kind of the act of what's happening here. So kind of giving athletes and performers, I don't want to use just athletes, but athletes and performers the skills to overcome the mental challenges and barriers that they face within their performances. Ideally, in a nutshell, that's kind of where it's housed. We can kind of bridge the lines to get into mental wellness. So, how do you kind of deal with the on performance, off performance, how they kind of interact with one another? So, it kind of starts to blend into that line of it. So, I've began working in spaces within business with business executives. How can you manage your stress and perform when you have a big corporate meeting or a big corporate sale to kind of go achieve? So it starts to teeter the line between wellness and performance a lot of the times, but overall, its goal is to enhance optimal performance and help individuals reach kind of that next step at a consistent rate. Obviously, we don't want to boost it up for just this one day, but how can we get you two steps above and remain at that, kind of remain at that performance level consistently?
Love it. All right, so let's go a little bit in your history. Let's take it back, way back. Kind of explain who you were before high school. What was growing up like for you?
Being from the Bay Area, it was a very diverse lifestyle. There wasn't one thing that I stuck to all the time. My primary background has always just been around the sport of basketball. I've been a basketball player pretty much my entire life. But growing up, I played every sport you could think of, whether it was soccer, baseball, football, volleyball, played that and sometime in there too. But that was always the dream, was to be a professional basketball player. As a kid, obviously before high school, it was at the NBA level. Once you get to high school, have a nice little good self-reflection and it drops down to international pro. And then once you start understanding what it takes to actually be an NBA player. But always for me, it's been a place of loving sports in general. So I knew at some point in my life that sports was going to be kind of the common denominator behind everything. But I had interest in other areas as well, whether it was journalism, sports marketing, even being a sports attorney at the time. Like I didn't even know much about being an agent and all that, but I kind of heard about being a sports attorney. And I'm all this is like before eighth grade hits. So it was just kind of a big interest of mine to being involved in sports. And most importantly, finding something that was stable for myself. I think stability is a huge thing for me, even today. So whether it was a place to perform in stability, as a basketball player, even academics finding stability. But at the end of the day, I always wanted a sense of stability per se. But I can't say that sports revolved 100% around me from the day I came out to kind of where I am now. Apparently, as a kid, I didn't even play with like trucks or cars, nothing like that. It was sport equipment. It was basketball. It was a football. It was a it didn't matter to me. But I mean, it was what I thoroughly enjoyed to this day. I still what I thoroughly enjoy, and I'm glad that kind of came true to where I can still work in a space that is revolved around sport.
There you go. I like it. So now you're in high school and you have to decide where you want to go to college. What was that decision like? Were there family members who helped guide you? And were you even thinking about the mental health space in high school at that time?
No, I to answer that last question, no. I mean, this is 2015. I personally wasn't. I mean, quickly, apparently my mom at the time was actually looking like surface level at actually getting me a sports psychologist at the time. But it wasn't kind of really a big thing there or like easily accessible kind of as it is now. But the decision to go to college was a late one. Because I wanted to go to college to play basketball. That was the dream. I really wasn't going to take that as a no, regardless, whether I had to go prep school or JUCO or whatever it was. Um, but I had a mentor at the time who had a connection with a college coach out here in Georgia. Called him up, and after a couple conversations, once my senior year season ended, I was able to make the decision to move out to Georgia and attend University of West Georgia. So between him, my parents, teammates, high school coaches, all helped really help me make that decision, decide, okay, look, this is the best offer that's on the table. Um, Granted, I got to go play where the other side of my family was also. So it was kind of a win-win there. I was comfortable with Georgia. I'd been almost like every year of my life. So being able to kind of decide to move out to Carrollton, Georgia, go to University of West Georgia to play there, high level Division II school. Uh, I mean, the decision was kind of easy once the opportunity presented itself. But I mean, at this time, there still wasn't like, look, I want to go down this mental performance side of it or involving some type of psychology into whatever realm that I'm going down.
So you mentioned you had family in the Atlanta metro area. Can you contrast the difference living in the Bay and now you're moving to Georgia? And it's on the outskirts, so it's slightly in the rural part of Georgia. Kind of contrast your experience from moving from California to Georgia.
Vastly different worlds, but yet very similar. Um, I think in the Atlanta area compared to like the Bay Area, like kind of like the real Atlanta part, not really the metro in the Bay Area, are similar in ways, or at least the old Bay Area was. Um, there's a lot of individuals from the Bay Area who moved to Atlanta to attend Morehouse, Spelman, Clark. So it's almost to me, I would say kind of like the second Bay Area at times. Um, I think now with the whole, just a different conversation, but the whole gentrification and all of that going on, I think there's similarities there as well. But out in Carrollton, life was very slow. I'm talking, we're in a city with 25,000 people. Um, I mean, you go to a grocery store and you're seeing the same faces over and over in California. I don't think that ever happens. So having to adjust to that, adjust to, as weird as it sounds, so many trees. Like I'm used to seeing buildings and cars everywhere, but now I'm in a place where I'm surrounded by trees and kind of nature, and it gets really quiet. And internally, it started to make my life quieter, which then got me inside of my head more. The quieter life around me got, the louder my thoughts got. In a sense, that can go one of two ways. It can go a very positive way, or it can kind of go more of a negative way. Unfortunate for me, it did go that negative way. It put me in a place where I wasn't really secure with myself and kind of the situation I was in anymore, just because it was so different. I couldn't just move on to the next day because life was moving so fast as it does in California. When you're out in the middle of nowhere, Georgia, what happens on Monday, you're still having the effects of that come Thursday. And then having to be a college basketball player at the time, and then pushing that aside, it just after practice, that popped right back up. Like there wasn't this continuous movement going on. Um, but I mean, in terms of kind of the people, they're all kind of pretty much the same. Well, Carrollton and Atlanta are definitely very different demographically. Um, but like I said, family was out here, so I was able to have a kind of a resource and kind of a sense of comfort if needed, if I ever took it. Probably should have used advantage of it more, but uh, very different yet similar worlds.
Yeah. Yeah. My older brother went to West Georgia, and there are some trappings, even though it's more of a rural town in that city. So
Yeah.
completely understand where you're coming from. So you mentioned that, towards the latter half of your college career, maybe you started to slow down on basketball or put it down completely. What was that like? And what was the effect? Because going from an intense competition world to maybe slowing down to, let's call it, being a regular civilian, that's tough.
It was really tough. Personally, I went through a lot in college. And I think by a lot, just even in a basketball perspective, I mean, the normal number of teammates you have on a team is, let's call it 12 to 15.
Mm-hmm.
In my 4 years, I had 43 different teammates. So, I mean, just in terms, I made great relationships with teammates I was there with, but at times it felt like every year was a reset. I
Mm-hmm.
think the most, uh, I think from like my freshman or sophomore year and then junior, senior year, had probably the most returners, but from my sophomore year to my junior year, the entire roster was depleted except for me. So then it became, okay, you have to be a leader now, and you're the only one that knows anything about this city. You're the only one that knows anything about the school. So everything kind of begins to run through you, right? You kind of become the tour guide of navigating life at this school out in Carrollton. So it began to kind of take an emotional toll on me and just kind of mental toll. And I was all for it because, I mean, leadership's a value of mine. It's a pretty good quality of mine. So I was fine with it. I was the point guard of the team. I was still playing. Like all of that was cool. But I think once I got into my senior year, we get a new head coach. So now it's like learn a whole new team, learn a whole new coach, whole new system. And then I think that burnout really just kind of crept up through that. And by the time we got to January, February, there was even a moment after one of our games, I was ready to call it quits. And it wasn't just from a performance standpoint, it was just that feeling of like, I can't do this anymore. Like I'm tired. I really, that's the kind of the best way to put it, was I was just mentally, emotionally tired from kind of doing a lot. Uh, I mean, it was point if teammate got in trouble, like I'm the first person getting called. Like it's little things like that at times that seem like can be so normal, but after a while it becomes taxing. Like that senior year, I moved away from my teammates, so I was living on my own. But it was still like, okay, he's our senior, our leader, our captain. Like everything still has to kind of get navigated in that direction. Um, Hosting all the recruiting visits, like all that stuff kind of starts to add up and you start to really push yourself away. Like there was no longer any attention or personal efforts to kind of better myself as a person, as a basketball player for the future. It was just all about kind of everybody else. And to an extent, that's like a good piece of it. But psychologically, when you look back on it, you can kind of see why I got to the end of that time. And I was like, I don't want to play competitive basketball ever again. I still love the sport. I still play it for fun because I just love basketball and what it brings for me. But competitively, nah, I was pretty much done with it. Made it through senior year. I was happy to take a break from it. But then again, like you said, then you hit that realization of I'm an everyday person now. I'm no longer labeled or viewed as this athlete anymore. Like now I'm just Aren. The downside was I don't know who Aren is because I've been an athlete since fourth grade. So that's, I don't even know the math behind that, but that's 10 plus years of my identity being wrapped around this one thing that I've never had the chance to kind of explore and build on outside of. And now all of it's over with. So now I have to figure out who that is. And do I do that by finding a job? And obviously, we all know this job market, especially coming straight out of college. Had a public relations degree. By the time I graduated, I was like, yeah, public relations isn't for me, but it got me through college. So it was a lot. It was kind of an identity crisis and took some time to figure out. Ultimately, I would say it took about 3 years post graduation before I really got to a point where I was, well, I'll split in half. About a year and a half or so, COVID hit, then I had to reinvent myself, but I kind of knew the process of how to do it by now. And then I would say officially, it kind of hit at like beginning of summer of 2022.
Gotcha. So during those 3 years that you break in half, what was going on? Were you working? Were you living life? Like what was going on that eventually you kind of found your way down this path?
So that summer, so I graduated in 2019. That summer, kind of applying to public relations type jobs, account manager, account executives, getting none of them because I have no experience. As an athlete, you unfortunately don't get the opportunity to, necessarily get the opportunity to do internships and kind of explore that world during those summers. Um, so I wasn't really landing opportunities. Took kind of a manual labor job with UPS for probably, let's call it 3 weeks. And I was like, yeah, this is not for me. Like I just knew that of myself that I wasn't fit out for that. Um, so then we moved out to kind of Atlanta from Carrollton. And then that September of 2019, decided to move back to California because I felt like my network was stronger there. Because now I can go back home where I know a lot more people, I have a lot more connections. Because let's be quite frank, in today's day and age, it's definitely more about who you know rather than what you know. So I was like, I'm gonna go to the side that supports who I know more. Come to find out, actually, it didn't even matter. Pac-12, that conference opened up a role as a broadcast associate in kind of their media management. I had a little experience with video editing and kind of that side of things and media services. So I was like, okay, cool. This can be just an entry to put something official on my resume, is how I kind of looked at it. So kind of did that for about 3 months, really understanding what it's like working in sports, inconsistent hours. I'm there from 3 p.m. to 11 p.m., watching Pac-12 games, cutting films, sending it up to the broadcast team. So I did that for about 2.5, 3 months. And then a position opened up internally that was within the strategic partnerships division. And I was looking at it and I was like, okay, this is now moving into that sports business side. And I'm looking at advertisement and marketing and kind of taking that mass communications, public relations background, blending it with sport while also being a creative at the same time. So I was able to apply to that internally, had an interview with them, and I got pretty much transferred over to that department. Fell in love with it. I was like, this is I like this. I like this being able to kind of have conversations with high brand executives. I mean, we're talking about CEOs, CFOs of some of these big name companies that they're now, hosting Pac-12 tournaments, um, doing market research on certain companies and seeing those deals come to life, being able to travel, go to these events to kind of look at kind of the brands and marketings and kind of seeing what you put out there come to life. I was set. I was like, oh yeah, this is my area, it's my wheelhouse. I enjoy this. I get to work with multiple different departments. Like this is kind of like the role that I thought was set for me. March 2020 hit. I think we all kind of know where that goes after that. Pac-12 furloughs about 75% of their company. So it was back to square one. I'm back to spring of 2019, graduating from undergrad, not really having anything, knowing who I am again. It was like I finally found it, and it just kind of got taken away. Uh, Luckily, one of my friends who was graduating from this university out in Oakland, California, Holy Names University, he had posted on an Instagram story that his school was starting a new program, or they were coming from a different school. They were bringing this program now to a 4-year school. Kind of piqued my eye, and it was the Applied Sport and Performance Psychology master's degree. Caught my interest a little bit. I was like, let me look into this a little bit just because I'm curious at what sports psychology really is. So I look into it, seems interesting. At this time, I still have no intention of going back to school. I was like, I'm done with school. I've been in school since you're 5 all the way to 22. Like, I don't want to do this anymore. And then COVID was supposed to be 2 weeks. And then it was 2 months. And, we're 4 years later. I feel like we're kind of still dealing with it a little bit heavier here and now. But then I was like, okay, I'm going to apply as a backup just because if COVID doesn't end, like I'll have something and I can have time to kind of reinvent myself again. I can kind of go put that student hat back on and kind of be labeled by that. Throughout that summer before that fall, they called me and they were like, hey, if you want to be a graduate assistant, you can come coach on our basketball team. And ideally, that can help fund your master's degree. I was like, oh, okay, maybe this has to be priority number one then. So I decided to go that route. So now I've transformed from a basketball player now to a basketball coach. So that was an experience in itself. But starting that graduate program that fall of 2020, it's kind of when it flipped again. And through my first class, I was like, oh, I love this field. I love being able to work with athletes, with performers, business, whatever performing. It can be an everyday person because to some extent, there's performance in everything that we do.
Right.
I fell in love with the field, the information we were learning. And this is first time taking psychology classes. And I mean, if you know psychology, there's a lot of reading and there's a lot of writing. And it wasn't bothering me. I was like, this is interesting. I'm learning about the concerns and issues I was having as an athlete. And I could connect it that way. I was like, oh, that's why that kind of turned out the way it did for me. So I go through that from fall of 20 all the way to the spring of 22, getting my master's degree there, finishing all of my applied hours, being able to work with a high school football team and a collegiate golf team. I was fine with it. I was like, I wanted my wheelhouse obviously to be basketball, but my program did a great job in making us go outside of our comfort zone and working with sports that we weren't comfortable with. Luckily for me, as I mentioned earlier, I'm a sports junkie. So it didn't matter what sport it was. I had content knowledge in it. So that made it a lot easier for me. But it was the connections, the relationships, the work that I was doing, the seeing the rewarding progress for these athletes, helping them in a way that I wish I had the help when I was playing without knowing at the time that I needed it. But looking back on it, like this would have made a huge difference in your projected path of any means. So that became why I did what I did. That guided me through till May of 2022. And fortunately, before I even graduated, I had 2 jobs already set to go as a mental performance consultant with one pretty high level company to start working with Division I athletes, overseas professional athletes, overseas players who come into America. And it's put me in a great position to kind of propel my career forward. But once that kind of May, June hit, after I got back for my vacation, graduation vacation, it was hitting the ground running. And I kind of had that identity there that sports psychology kind of created for me and allowed me to, one, become more comfortable with who I was, just a person, what I had to offer, what I brought to the table, but then even a title and what I'm able to offer other people, and just kind of be that resource, that light for them, that person to kind of push somebody when they need it. So that's kind of all came full circle rather quickly. It wasn't easy, I would say, but it became a worthwhile process and a very needed one, quite frankly.
Very good, very good. So let's take it back a step. So you're going into your master's program. Um, a lot of times we know it takes a lot of family support to continue education, and a lot of hoorah and hype about undergraduate. But when we talk about graduates, like, why are you going back to school? What type of support did you receive? Did you have to overcome some things to go through that program?
Uh, I guess we can say, fortunately, my family were the ones who wanted me to go back to grad school. I think initially, like when I was an undergrad, they're like, "Yeah, and then you're gonna go get your master's," and I was like, "Who's going back to school?" So I think when it came time again, they were kind of like, "I told you so."
Mhm.
Uh, but I mean, I had great support. My parents, my fiance, who was my girlfriend at the time, they were all super supportive of it. Um, I think it put me back. I think they knew it was huge for me for that identity piece because they can see me externally kind of losing who I was again. Um, it put me in a place of helping people again. I mean, it wasn't too daunting because it was still COVID at the time. This is still 2020. So there is no going to class. So
Yeah.
my work is at home. So I'm in Zoom classes, I'm doing essays and stuff like that at home. So everyday life doesn't necessarily change because COVID lasted pretty much until spring of 22. So pretty much my entire program was still at home. And then luckily enough, financially, it didn't become a burden either. So the support was easily given because there were no like halts that were really being put to life, right? There wasn't like I was turning down money to go back to school, or there wasn't changing in dynamics because I'm now going to class full time and stuff like that. So I think that made it a lot easier for myself and as well as kind of everybody else that was around me at the time.
You're good. So you mentioned you said we moved from Georgia to California. So I'm assuming it was your girlfriend at that time.
Yeah.
Uh, I have a lot of these interviews, and a lot of times the ladies talk about dating while they're in their master's program or their doctoral program. How was it you maintaining a relationships, especially with the cultural expectations put on men sometimes? Like, how did you balance that? Was it just, hey, I found a special lady, or did y'all have to have a lot of conversations throughout the years you were studying for your master's?
Luckily we met in school. We met in undergrad at the University of West Georgia. So I mean, she understood the life of being with a college basketball player and student at the time. Um, Fortunately, also, she was getting her master's degree at the same time. So once I started that fall, she started that January. So we were in it together. So
Mhm.
that made it helpful. We had nights where we're sitting there working on essays and studying at the same exact time. Um, so I think my experience made it pretty easy because we were there to motivate each other. It's like, man, I really don't want to do this assignment. Well, look, I got to do mine too. So let's go do it together. So I think there weren't really any extra conversations or anything like that. We both knew that these degrees would help push our careers forward, and they've done so. She's now killing it in her field, what she does, and it's because she kind of took that sacrifice to go back to school, also get her master's degree. She's considering her doctoral degree right now. I think her seeing me go through mine might be pushing her a little away from it because it doesn't really change her field as much as it does for me. Um, but I mean, I think to answer your question just straightforward, like it it wasn't really much conversations that really need to be had. We both had an understanding of the benefits behind it. Um, and luckily we were doing it together. It wasn't something that we had to do separately because hers was online as well. So it just kind of became part of our daily, weekly routine that, these days, let's sit down, let's knock this homework out, let's study for this exam. We both had board exams to pass at the end of our program, so we studied and knocked those out, and it became just kind of something we were both doing collectively. And they were cousin fields almost. She's kind of in behavioral psychology, I'm in performance psychology, so there was overlap between the two, which then made it interesting and how we can kind of look at the different dynamics but also similar dynamics. So it just made the process, it made it a lot more enjoyable than kind of conflicting as some people may experience.
I think that's a beautiful story. I don't think you hear that aspect like, hey, we're in this together. That's pretty cool. Now, I do have to ask if you're in school and she's in school, how are the bills getting paid?
She was still working at the time because she was considered an essential worker.
Yeah.
Uh, so she was still working. Uh, Luckily, just from when I was working at Pac-12, I was able to even file for unemployment for a little bit. And with unemployment and then like the COVID relief fund on top of it that they were providing, I was actually making more money unemployed than I was when I was employed. So that helped. I am very fortunate and blessed also that my parents were financially in a position to help when needed. Because I moved back to California, so we were not living with them, but we were living near them. So I mean, if things did end up getting tight, I could go to them and be like, "Hey, can we go grocery shopping?" And they're like, "Hey, let's do it." Um, so that helped. We were living we actually ended up moving at one point, but we had a nice place that we were living in at first that was relatively cheap because it was a rent controlled building and we knew who was staying there before.
Yeah.
So we were able to kind of save money on housing and living out there. I only had one car at the time. So we were living more of a kind of a minimal lifestyle. And again, like I said, it's COVID. There's not really much you can go and spend money on. So, and living in an apartment, I mean, you pay your rent and a couple extra utilities, and then you're good for the month, right? Uh, so between her kind of carrying it on that time in our life, my parents, kind of the unemployment stuff, that kind of helped push us through those 2 years that we knew was going to be a sacrifice ideally. And then you get to the point where you come out on the other side of it, and then you kind of deal with all the kind of the rewards that you kind of went through when you were dealing through that time.
I know a lot of people I cross paths with. COVID was tough for a lot of people, but it did bring out some, let's say, simpler times. Do you sometimes you were able to study? You can't go anywhere, so you have to take walks in the park. They took down the goals on the basketball court, so you really had to do something else. What do you think about that time where things were, because there's limited stuff to do, they were easier times?
It really did give you a perspective on just what's being present. I think kind of from a psychological perspective of being present and really mindful of what's happening. I was living in Oakland at the time, and literally 50 yards from the front of my apartment building is Lake Merritt. So it's this beautiful lake that has a walk around path, and every day you're just seeing people out there picnicking, walking their dogs, walking the lake. So when we had to take our dog out at the time every day, I mean, you got to go to the lake, got to be by the water, just kind of embrace it and know that like I don't really have anything else to do today. So I can just kind of stand out here and kind of deal with what's right in front of me. So it definitely was simpler times. Living in the Bay Area, we probably were the worst county in the world in terms of restrictions. Seeing other states and kind of the leniency they had, we were pretty jealous because we weren't allowed to do anything. Uh, but it did, in a sense, kind of give you that space and time to kind of just take a step back and you understand what like we take for granted at times. Like we take the opportunity to go to the gym or even go to the park and play basketball or go grocery shopping or catch a flight, go to the movies. Like all of that stuff was remotely taken away from us. So you have to learn how to make the most of it. So whether that's hanging out with your friends by having a picnic outside or simply even calling somebody and just sitting there having a conversation. And I mean, I think I'm one of the few people that are actually that like COVID was great for me. It was in a personal, professional, like just in all realms of my life, COVID actually was a huge help for me. It's weird to think that through a global pandemic that it can be beneficial or positive, but for me, it really made a huge difference.
Gotcha. So during your master's program, you mentioned that you were able to coach. Were you able to apply some of your learnings to how you were coaching those players on your team?
Absolutely. And I think that's what continued to make the field interesting for me. Because when I'm learning in class, when I'm learning in group dynamics, whether it's learning an icebreaker, a certain skill, I get to go apply it to my athletes right the very next day or even the same day. So then I'm getting live feedback of, okay, this stuff really does work. Like I'm seeing a difference every single day with these Division II college basketball players, what sports psychology really can do to a performer's performance, to their skill set, to their mindset, to their well-being. Um, and I kind of became, I wouldn't say I became kind of the sports psych guy for that team, but in terms of when mental health, mental wellness, or kind of mental performance concerns popped up, they came to me about it. Uh, and it was great because I got to understand dynamic like coach athlete relationships, group dynamics, player to player relationships, all the external pressures and performance anxieties. As I'm reading about them and writing papers about them, I get to watch it happen in person also. So it was really helping connect those dots by having that education, but then a real world examples and experiences happening right in front of me. It made a world of difference. I got to practice administering certain skills or having certain conversations, whether they knew it or not. I mean, it became not a, I wouldn't say a training ground. That seems so like using them kind of language, but for me, it became a place to really just connect everything together. And I loved every part of it. Um, so I mean, it just made coaching a lot easier. It made learning and kind of taking those next steps and kind of that educational interest to the next level.
I love it. So you have your master's degree, you're able to do all your hours clinically. For some reason, you still want to get your doctorate. What what made that decision for you? Like, what were you thinking about when you decided to make that leap?
I think there's a couple different factors. I think the first one, I mean, just with psychology in general, you don't need a doctorate, but having a doctorate does not hurt. It more helps than hurts anyway. Just seeing jobs out there and reading job applications of what I wanted to do down the line. Like I mentioned before, wanting to work in a professional space, wanting to be a director of mental performance at a university, whatever it is, all of those seem to require doctorates. And I was like, I'm interested enough in what I do and what I'm learning to want to go back to school because it doesn't seem daunting to me because I enjoy what I'm doing. So there's one side of it. Second side of it, I went to my first sports psychology annual conference. And at the conference, we had a Black student and professional meetup. And at this time, there's like 150 something. There's a lot of us at this in this conference room introducing ourselves and stuff like that. And this year, everyone literally had a chance to stand up, introduce themselves. And I don't know, probably it felt like 70% of students through there, and they were like, yeah, I'm either about to start my doctorate or I'm in my first or my second year of it. And I had just started mine actually. So I had already made the decision that I was going back to school. I don't think I'm like 1 month into like, not even 1 month. I think I started 2 weeks before this conference. I already made the decision. But then hearing everybody else like, oh, I'm going to get my doctor, I'm going to obtain this. I was like, okay, like I can't be the one not to have it. Right. So then it just gave me kind of that more motivation. But then it also allowed me to understand that I was on the right path. Right. I was like, okay, I'm in alignment with what the interest, what kind of the want from this field is. A lot of people are on the clinical counseling side of things. I'm on a non-clinical track, and I'm perfectly okay with that just because my experience without having the clinical counseling side has gotten me to where I am now. So then adding kind of that PsyD on top of kind of my master's, my CMPC, whatever other certifications come down the line, I knew that getting my doctor was going to be worth it for me. Um, I go through a really applied program right now, which is very similar like when I was coaching. Things that I'm learning in my classes, I can apply directly to a client 2 hours later, or vice versa. It's helping me understand certain concepts because I'm dealing with an athlete who's going through some of these things that we're learning. But I think just my interest and love for this field, the information, what it kind of brings results wise, it made the decision of going back to school and finishing this milestone of being a doctor, it made it without hesitation. So I went from dreading and never, ever, ever going back to school again to now pushing out like another 7 years of school, or yeah, almost, yeah, about 6.5 years more of school, uh, but loving every moment of it.
If you don't mind, speak to that a little bit more, going from an athlete to now an academic, right? A scholar, as so they say. That's a shift. Um, Kind of explain that journey of your mindset to saying I'm not the physical athlete, but I'm leveraging my mind to affect the change I want in society. So like, when did that shift happen, and kind of help other athletes through that shift while you speak on that?
I would say, well, first off, if you would have told me this 10 years ago, I probably would have laughed in your face. Like, there's no way I would have ever imagined myself where I'm at now, just in terms of academia. And I'm sure there's a lot of people from my childhood that would do that still to this day. Like, I cannot believe you're getting your doctorate. I'm like, yeah, sometimes I can't either. Um, but I would say, kind of with towards the end of my master's degree is when it shifted, and I think it was really surrounded around that identity piece. I
Hmm.
became clear of what my mission was, what I valued behind it, what it truly brought to me as an individual, what kind of the reward was it in terms of profession and adding to the field, because with it being such a new field, there's so many whiteboards that we can add on to. It's not like this a certain field that's been around for centuries and centuries that it's like a set in stone way. Every day sports evolve, society evolves, the athlete evolves. So this is luckily a field that I enjoy evolving with. Like, that's one of my things I love, is being able to adapt and adjust to things. So I think by the time I got to the end of my master's degree, I was like, this is who I am. This is the place that gives me a similar feeling to being an athlete and
Hmm.
kind of that performance setting. Like, are there practices? Yeah, when I'm reading an article and prepping sessions and workshops, that's my practice. Do I get to perform? Do I get to review what I'm doing? Do I see a result of it? Do I still get to build relationships? Because I mean, that's a whole hour conversation about the relationships that basketball has brought me and has put me in. So that really, that identity piece became huge. And that's kind of the biggest advice I would have for, athletes, is to be able to spend time figuring out what that is and understanding that it's not going to happen overnight. I think a lot of us want to have that answer right when we're done playing, but unfortunately, it doesn't work like that. Sometimes it takes time to find what that interest is, but sometimes it's going to be another grind. We don't just pick something up and become great at it right away. I mean, it's rare. You have your anomalies out there that kind of do that, but I think taking that time to really, really focus on your identity development, figure out who you are as an athlete, but also who you are outside of that, what you value, what you have interest in, and what you can create that simulates kind of that emotional feeling that, brings kind of that gratification, I guess you can say, whether it's finances, psychology, coaching, training, being a teacher, whatever it might be. There's something out there that will also get you kind of excited to wake up in the morning, I guess you can put it. Um, but it sometimes takes time. Sometimes it takes bumps and bruises. Sometimes it takes you going in one direction, falling down and getting back up again. Sometimes it takes doing something you thought you had no interest in at all, going back to school. And it happened to be coincidental. If one of my friends never posted it on the Instagram story, I can't say that we're here having this conversation right now, because I could be on a completely different path. Um, so I think in a nutshell, that's kind of what it comes down to, is just figuring out who you are and that identity piece, and that begins to kind of carry it. Because I don't even look at myself as like an academic. Like, I'm just looking at myself as mental performance guy, or a guy that helps athletes reach their next levels. But there's things that come with it, and I'm perfectly okay, and I'm in line with doing the things that come with it.
Love it. During our prep call, we talked about something. Can you describe performing and non-performing personalities? You had mentioned that we all have both. So how do you see performing and non-performing personalities, and how can a professional or an athlete leverage these concepts?
It's always an interesting conversation, because some people believe you should have different ones. Some people believe you should have similar ones, and some people believe you should have the same ones. Um, I'm one of those people that are on the side of similar. I don't think necessarily who you are off the court has to be the exact same as who you are on the court, but there to some extent should be complementary to one another. So when we talk about mindsets and performing, obviously Kobe Bryant always jumps out, and just kind of Mamba mentality. Mamba mentality isn't when he's at home with his kids and wife and kind of enjoying that time of his life. But to an extent, he's in the gym at 4 a.m. and then 7 a.m. and then 10 a.m. Like, there's complementary aspects that boost one another. I had a current athlete that was found too much of a split between the two, and realized that it was affecting his performance. Through kind of a lot of mindfulness awareness and understanding that, and conversations, we were able to understand that and bridge them back together. He saw performance rise, because his off the court life and his on the court life were then complementary and similar to one another. Some people can get away with having completely different lives. Some people can get away with having the exact same, being the exact same person, bringing that personality onto one another. The thing is, it comes down, personally to me, I think it comes down to kind of the external factors that we have to deal with. The external factors you face in competition aren't going to be the ones that you face outside of it. Like, there's not always going to be opponents and crowds and fans and pressure from like societal pressures in terms of your personal life. So you're going to be a different person. You approach situations differently. But understanding and having the tools to like enhance or solve on both sides, I think, is where our field comes in handy, especially when I talk about dealing with that mental wellness side. So if I can teach an athlete to enhance their self-confidence, or to help control their focus, that skill can now work while, let's say you're a student athlete, can work while you're in class, but then also can work while you're on the basketball court. So there is that similarity. They're kind of like that bridge that connects the two. So I think in a short way, I would say, making sure that bridge is foundational and solid is the key to kind of having that optimal kind of personality blend between performance and personal life.
Yeah. Yeah. I tell my wife all the time, I have to go play basketball because I have to yell, scream, throw a pick so I can come home and be the nice, gentle teddy bear that she needs.
Not
Uh,
definitely.
you mentioned a lot about confidence, and confidence is a big area, I believe, your study. Talk about confidence, because as a professional, I have to go out and perform. I have to speak to people. I have to protrude confidence so they believe in my plan, so they can execute it. What is it about confidence that really has like a societal impact?
It might be a controversial thing to say, but confidence is one of those things that you don't necessarily know is true or not when you see it.
Mm.
And I think that's what can get complicated for those who are trying to develop their confidence, because I can go online, I can look up someone who I think is extremely confident, and they're fighting with demons on the inside. They are panicking, they're sweating, they're breaking down. And then you can see someone who might be shy or quiet or reserved, but are extremely confident. I think we always hear all the time, like, fake it till you make it. And some people really do that, and it works for them. Um, but when we look at confidence, there's two different sides of it. You have your state confidence and your trait confidence. Your state confidence is like in the moment. I might be a super confident basketball player, but the moment I take my shoes off, I'm not anymore. I can't go have a certain conversation with a random person because I'm just not confident in that. If you ask me to drive here with someone random in the car, I might not be confident with that. Then you have your trait confident people, and those are the ones where it's embedded within their personality. We all know those type of people that are just sometimes overly confident. Like, why are you so confident in this uncomfortable, unknown situation? So that's why I find it so interesting. I think that's why it's so impactful when we hear about it a lot, because I think it's also just watered down at times, especially in sports. We hear, oh, just go out there and be confident. What does that mean? What does that look like? Tim Duncan, is he confident because he's not expressive versus Patrick Beverly? Is he confident, or does he do that to mask, the lack of confidence? So I think that's what's interesting about it, is because we don't actually have a visual image of what it looks like through someone else's eyes. We know what it can feel like for us, being prepared, having trust in our training, having verbal, like being persuaded verbally, utilizing what we see from somebody else, just kind of our own state. Like I said, the trader state. Internally, we know what we're confident about and what we're not confident about. But again, like you said, like, you have to go out there and perform, sell what you're doing. You might not be confident in that, but you have to portray that in order to get the job done. So my job is working with athletes to make sure that they are confident, or they can find ways to make that state confident as consistent as possible. How can we pull from your past experiences, or are there things you need to do in terms of, affirmations and speaking yourself the right way, and having certain focus points that allow you to stay in line with your confidence at a consistent rate? How can you stay confident after a failure or a setback, right? How do I go 0 for 10 and be confident enough to hit the 11th one that's a game winner? Those are the challenges that athletes face. And are they just going off of luck, or do they truly believe in their ability? Is that the same off the floor, right? That's where confidence gets tricky. And you can have these conversations with 10 other people in my field, and I guarantee you they'll give you some different piece of confidence that becomes very interesting, tricky, and can go different directions. But I think personally for me, why it's such a huge interest in our field, and just like I said, myself, is it comes down to that. You don't actually know what it looks like to have an example of it, but when you feel it.
Mm, understood. And to me, that's the gray area. Like you said, is it really confidence that anybody cares about, or is it performance? I guess externally, everybody cares about performance. Internally, we only care about confidence. Kind of speak to that dynamic. Like, does it matter how you feel as long as you perform? Well, it matters to me how I feel. But when I talk about I need help for something, if I'm asking for advice, I want somebody to perform. So kind of think about that dynamic where really all society wants is you to perform.
I mean, we hear all the time sports is a business. I mean, I think in anything's business, whether it's, your business yourself. At the end of the day, ideally, I guess the kind of stereotypical boss would not really care whether you're confident or not. It's like, did you get them to buy into the product? Yes or no? Like, it comes down to that. That's great if you were confident or not, but like, did you get the job done? I think in performance, I mean, in sports, it's kind of the same way. I just sent out a survey to a group of athletes, and one of the questions on it was, even when I'm not confident, I'm still able to perform well. And that's an interesting concept because we can see who says yes, who says no. And then it's like, okay, let's figure out ways to keep you confident, or let's figure out, is it really your confidence that controls your ability to perform? Mm. I think that's when it gets tricky. Like, even though I'm not confident, am I still able to put a ball in a basket, kick a ball into a net, make a sale? If the answer might be yes, then do we even need to worry about developing your confidence, or is that just who you're going to be? Like, is there a difference between confident version of you and not? But ideally, at the end of the day, everything kind of does come down to results, right? Like, that's why we have wins, that's why we have losses, we have performance enhancement. Do you even kind of mentally enhance to some extent? Like, I don't think we would have a role in sports psychology if there wasn't a betterment of our athletes. Um, so whether or not I go present to a group or work with the individual athlete, I'm confident or not, to some extent there is a result that we want to achieve. Um, so it's interesting because, like, it goes back to say, what does confidence actually look like and what does it actually do? Because at the end of the day, I still have to get this positive result, or like that's the goal out of it. And if I can do it without being confident, great. I'm just going to be this really good person that's not confident, or do I need to be confident to get that to achieve?
Very interesting. So, what's kind of next for you? You're right now in your doctoral program. What do you expect to happen when that is over with? What type of jobs or opportunities do you expect to come your way?
I would say with the experience that I've accumulated over the last 2 years, well, year and a half, yeah, I'll call it 2 years, and just kind of trajectory wise, what more experience I'll have in the next 2 years by the time I finish. I think pairing that with that kind of doctoral degree does kind of put me in a category of being able to work with professional athletes, um, whether it's NFL, MLB, MLS. Obviously, NBA is the big goal for me because, like I said, I'm a basketball guy. So why wouldn't I want to work for an NBA team? I think I can begin to really be, involved in those conversations and potentially those decisions of, working with those high profile athletes with that kind of doctorate stamp. Not necessarily saying you need it. I've connected with someone who's had success in the NBA space who doesn't have his doctorate degree in this field. He's told me before, he was like, it's not something you need to have. Like, if you know the right people, if you do good work, if your purpose is the right and it's meant to be, like, you're going to get there regardless. I'm a person where I still want to have kind of all my bases covered and have the time and resources to do it at the time. But I think kind of in that space, as well as this field is evolving so much, it's growing so fast that there might be a whole other world of opportunities out there that I don't even know about yet. We're starting to see it within the university athletic department systems where they're starting to split between your traditional psychologists dealing with the clinical and counseling, and then the sports psychology side, and being able to work with them together and kind of triangulate all of that psychological information. That route might be able to open up. And now there's head of sports psychology or director of sports psychology working directly with head of psychology, like athlete psychology, whatever it might be. Uh, so my personal goal, obviously, is within the NBA, NFL. I would say leaving with those two, being fully embedded within an organization, working with all those stakeholders involved, community work with that. Um, but then also there's a side of unknown that in 2, 3 years, 2, 3, 4 years, like who knows? Because from this point now to where it was when I first graduated, there's been a drastic change. There's been so many different opportunities that have just opened up, not just for me, but for our field in general. And I can only imagine what 2, 3 more years are going to look like as people start to invest more into their mental and finding the kind of the value in it. Uh, and just kind of the nature of our world and the need for it. I mean, it's a whiteboard of opportunities and blank spaces that can get filled.
I like it. So this is an episode on building wealth and mental health. And even though you're not full time in what you're doing in the future, you have navigated, I would say, a lot of financial aid and a lot of being able to get and obtain education that costs a lot of money. This stuff is not free. Any advice that you would give somebody financially, a student going up through the ranks, as far as how to handle their money?
I mean, as cliche as it sounds, it's, be smart with it. I don't know. I mean, in a nutshell, I think it's putting your money in places that are going to be beneficial for you in the long term. Um, but then it's also having a balance of it because you're only in your 20s once. Like, so I personally still think there's times where like you're like, hey, let's randomly go on a trip or something like that. Like I take joy in that and still kind of having a life and utilizing my money now to experience that life. I don't want to go through my entire 20s and just like, oh, I need to save, 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 save for the future. And now I'm dreading my 20s. Like it's my 30s and 40s, have kids, and it's like, dang, I missed out on so much. So I think there's that balance. Investing in assets versus investing in yourself is obviously very huge. I'm also in a very different position than most that I didn't have to take out financial aid until I got to my doctoral program. So there's going to be very few individuals that go all the way through a doctoral program and only be $60,000 in debt. Like it's not often. Just because I mean I was on scholarship in undergrad. Like I mentioned, my grad school was paid for because I was coaching, so almost like another scholarship. Um, so I didn't really have to take out money until I got to my my doctorate program. Um, so for me, it's I like again, like I said, I've been very blessed that I've had a family that's been able to, they've been successful enough to be able to provide and kind of give me that security blanket to go out on a risk and not have to just like sit there and work for 2 years while I'm getting my master's degree. Um, but I still think it comes down to making sure you budget and manage your money. You get $10 a month, figuring out, starting those habits of budgeting out, allocating money in certain directions. Um, but then, I mean, like I said, I'm still one of those people, and it might be against financial experts' advice and stuff like that, but still be able to have time to, utilize it, have fun, live your life, because I mean, we only get one of these. So, I mean, being able to kind of maximize that, but then also setting yourself up in the long run is definitely like an important thing to do. But I would still just kind of aid on the side that money comes and goes. You're going to have highs, you're going to have lows of it. But if you have consistent structures and understanding how to manage and utilize it, it makes those highs and those lows easier to deal with. And I would say also minimizes the gap between the two of them.
I like that. And I think you said a lot. I think one, when we talk about performance, you have to live your life in a certain way. So you want to perform, right? A carrot and a stick. And getting scholarships, there's multiple ways to skin the cat as far as getting a master's program, which you mentioned as far as being a coach. Those opportunities are out there. You just have to be open and receptive for when those come. So I think that's excellent. So thanks again for joining us. I think what you explained, your profession, where you're going with it, and I think your journey is going to be helpful for a lot of people. So thank you for joining us.
Absolutely. I appreciate the opportunity to kind of come on here and share that with whoever these eyes kind of land on. And I mean, definitely love to have these conversations and looking forward to more.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much. You take care.
Do the same.
The more I know, the more money I can make.